So again, we're going to go and transition to a business model overview. Again, I know this is a lot of information. Again, it's here for your reference. All right. So again, I don't want you to think that you've got to get all of this down pat. It is here for you to reference. It is here for you to come back to. But again, I do want you to understand, particularly if there are community members in the audience, you have to understand the business side of broadband infrastructure, of broadband service provision generally. There's a business side that we must account for as we move forward in this life cycle and the process. So let's look at some sample business models. And first, we're going to look at the business model life cycle from an overview standpoint. You generally start from strategy, right? Network, product, and customer strategy. And this is a little summation of what we talked about before. Now, we're looking at local conditions. We have a product strategy. We have a market segmentation, right? This is from the service provider standpoint. This is how they look at an opportunity, right? So they have a group of strategy people, they get together and they want to know, before we make a decision to move forward, what are the local conditions, right? What's our product strategy? How are we deploying? What product are we deploying? What's the delta between the cost and the money that we can make off of this particular strategy? From the service offering standpoint, it's really voice, data, or video, right? It's advent of streaming technology now. Data is very important. Not so much video per se, not so much voice even, but data is really the key. Are there any value-added services now? So you see a lot of providers will have a streaming element. They'll have derivative services or partnerships with other companies. You'll see that as well. And then is there a value proposition between speed and cost, right? The higher the speed, generally the more costly that service component is going to be on the end user. So again, understanding this business model from a strategy standpoint will help you as you enter into those discussions with local service providers, or ultimately, if the community decides to go at it at its own on a municipal build. So the next we're going to look at is the marketing and sales. So now we have our strategy, we have our approach. Now we bring in our marketing and sales team. So again, I'm giving you a view from a typical broadband service provider standpoint in an effort to help you understand, the steps involved, right? So in my marketing and sales plan, I am looking at everything from retail to wholesale business to channel sales strategies. I'm looking at my product bundling opportunities, my various pricing of all those services, and then any promotional strategies, right? What can I offer the community to get more people to take this service when and if we deploy it? So again, have my strategy team, we decide to go. Now my marketing and sales team, they're in action. Their job is to generate the business, the revenue, the income that we'll need to operate. And on this slide, we're going to talk about financial modeling and planning. Particularly the 4 criteria are investment plan, the capital requirements, operating budgets, and financial forecasting and modeling. And it's really important from a community's perspective to understand the funding strategy, any debt or investor obligations, and the ownership structure of a project or a planned build. You need to understand the capital requirements, right? There are significant upfront costs, particularly for construction or build-out projects. There are also capital requirements for working capital needs as the project is deployed and continues to add on customers. And then a consideration of any type of expansion. And that's generally done by a phased approach. For my accounting types and business people, you have to understand operating budgets and then to be able to financial forecast and model so that you can adjust to changing conditions and behaviors in the market. And what I want you to take away from this, and you can convey this to the community as you work with them, the capital requirements will vary depending on the project's development phase, right? As we mentioned in the last slide, there are significant upfront capital costs at the beginning part of a new project, whether that's a project build or a phased implementation or even an expansion. Generally, those upfront capital costs and working capital requirements will result in the project operating at a loss of the first several years of the project, year X, right? And at some point after network operations begin, you start to lower that gap, right? Those total expenses, you're starting to bring in customers, you're bringing on revenue, and then at some point in the future X, you reach a break even point. And for service providers, they like the return on investment is after this break even point. So anytime after the break even point where your revenue exceeds your total expenses, you're in that area of positive return. And so really understanding those capital requirements, understanding how to pay for them. We've done an excellent job here at Broadband USA with our grant information. There are a ton of grants and federal money and state money now that's available. There's philanthropic sources and venture capital, private sources as well. But you really need the community to understand that there are significant upfront costs those first several years of a project. Generally with telecommunications projects, we're looking to 7 to 10 years operating at some point of a loss. And then at some point after that 7-10 year period, again, the network will be operating at a profit. So again, it's key that you understand that, particularly as you are dealing with and talking to your local service providers. So finally, let's talk about the operations plan. This really quickly, we're going to talk about network operations, maintenance, expansion, your service provisioning, your billing, and your customer care. So the network has been constructed, everything is ready to go, and you're adding on customers. These are additional components that you have to account for, right? Your operating plan needs to account for these functions, and more importantly, who fulfills them in terms of staff, vendors or contractors, or strategic partners, right? Network operations, maintenance, that's, keeping the trains running, if you will, right? Your billing and your customer care deals with the happiness of your customers. How do you deal with customer complaints or customer issues? How do you deal with customer management issues? And then service provisioning, service delivery, network expansion, that's just, making sure that you're future-proofing the network, and again, that everything is running the way it's supposed to. And then if you're going to expand, accounting for that expansion and making sure that when you do expand, that does not impact your existing network operations, your network capacity, and that customer experience. So let's talk about finding the right model. We're in the final few slides, and I want to thank you all for your attention and your diligence today. We're going to talk about the business case, right? It's all about the business case. We've gone through several modules now, and you know about planning and how important planning is. You know how important it is to make the case to stakeholders and the service provider community, and also how important it is to evaluate those key partnerships. So this slide just sums it all up. Whether you're talking about local government structures, private sector investment, community forces, state and local conditions, you really need to understand all of this in the planning process. In making the case, that's the data, that's the business case, that's your customers, understanding the market, right? The key point in this is the community should always keep the goals it previously identified, combined with the knowledge of its own assets and limitations as it continues to move forward with the decision-making process. And then finally, evaluating those key partnerships, right? While strategic partnerships may not fit every community environment, communities should nonetheless assess the ability of partners when building a broadband business case. And that's making sure you have a diverse set of partners on, whether they be private sector, public sector, philanthropic, community organizations, you name it. The more partners you can bring to the table, the better it will be for your project. And it also is important to note that regardless of the business model, understand that partners play important roles at important times. Generally, your government leaders can serve as catalysts, right? They can work with the private sector. They can work through national and state and local government and policy issues. And these local and state government entities serve as leaders to garner community support, identify both needs publicly and privately. They develop innovative solutions, and can attract private investment. When you're working with private sector partners, we're really looking to the ingenuity and funding aspect, right? The private sector partner is going to bring, network service, it's going to bring equipment knowledge. It's going to be made up of vendors, developers, technology firms, and they all bring expertise and resources and innovation to the table. For the community side, your outreach and demand, your community anchor institutions, your nonprofit community groups, your research and education community, your government networks, these all build that initial demand and capacity for the long run success of the project. So again, regardless of the model, understanding your partners, understanding when they play their roles, how they play their roles, and how that impacts the overall execution of the project is also very, very important. These last few slides I'm going to touch on just briefly. These are just examples of the various types of private and publicly led partnership models for broadband projects. This slide here just provides a business model overview of a privately led broadband project, right? Investment, ownership, and governance, the commercial provider, the commercial operator is going to build, own, and operate that network. That funding is generally private, but may be augmented by grants, as we talked about before, state and local and federal grants. You see over here on the right, they have benefits, and you see the challenges. So again, as you study these and if you work with the community, understand that the privately led project will always look to benefits more than costs and challenges, right? Because the private organization, the private entity is taking on all of that, both from a revenue standpoint, from a resource standpoint, but also the risk standpoint as well. Next, we're going to focus on publicly led broadband projects. Again, investment, ownership, and governance is usually by a public entity. We usually know this by it's a municipal project, right? The state, the county, or the city government, or sometimes a municipal electric utility. It's going to own the network. The public may either use an existing organization, such as a municipal electrical system or utility system, or just create an entirely new broadband network or network system, right? State and federal grants may augment these public funding sources, such as bonds and other public sources. Again, there are benefits to it, but there are also challenges. Most notably, the community must raise the capital and take the fiduciary risk and responsibility necessary for completing the project. So again, when you're evaluating and working with the community to decide the specific business model approach, understand that publicly led model is going to have a lot of risk and challenges on the community. And then next, the most common that we see is public-private partnerships, right? The investment, ownership, and governance, and P3s, as they're known by, are generally one or more commercial operators. They can be private or nonprofit organizations, and one or more public enterprises that jointly invest in the network or the project and share capacity, both risk and the benefits. Either party may own the assets or share in that ownership, and state and federal grants may be used to augment other federal or private funding sources. The network operations, the network is generally operated by the commercial partner, and the public entity provides resources and support. The community also plays a role, right? Community financing is a key driver. Community feasibility studies, augmenting that demand, planning and regulatory support are also critical. So again, this is truly a public-private partnership model where risk is shared. There are also significant challenges. And again, this is going to be a delicate balance between, which entity owns the risk and which entity achieves and receives the benefit. So again, this is more common public-private partnership when you're dealing with broadband networks. And again, it's going to be up to the community to decide which model it wants to roll and move forward with. And then next, we'll talk about broadband cooperatives. That's also a fairly new model that really focuses in on cooperatives. where those cooperatives may be public-centric utilities or some type of consortia of private entities. Right? Investors are generally in the public and may include state and federal funding. Particularly with broadband cooperatives, the community plays a very important part because community financing, again, is the key driver. It may even be local, state, federal, or some combination. When you're looking at the benefits and the challenges, capital from outside investors reduce the risk associated with public financing, and it also generally leads to experienced utilities that understand infrastructure projects. They have the capacity, the people, the skills, the knowledge to be able to build or expand broadband projects. But there are also some key challenges as well. Cooperatives are not known for explosive growth, and that expansion is likely to take place over a period of time as the company reinvests those earnings. And that typically is a slow or a more slow process. Again, these are generally closed networks, unlikely to be open access, meaning that they may not be a catalyst for last mile development or additional middle mile investment, but there always will be some form of community financing with broadband cooperatives. So the members of the cooperative, the community, will always play an important role and piece in understanding and executing this business model. And so I want to thank you again for taking the time out to sit through this next module on broadband networks and business plans. I really appreciate the time that you have taken with us today, and I hope this information will be beneficial for you as you work with the community that you will be working with in this project. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you on our next module. Thank you.